My name is Rabbi Rami. I am the director of Wisdom House on the Scarrett Bennett campus. Wisdom House is Scarrett's Interfaith Education Center. And I'm going to take a moment to talk about that. And Kim Roberts-Johnson is VP of Programming. She was supposed to be here tonight and say welcome on behalf of Scarrett Bennett, but she is very ill. So welcome on behalf of Kim Roberts-Johnson and Scarrett Bennett. So I just want to take a couple of minutes to talk about Wisdom House. Basically, if you have the little handout. Anyone not have a handout? Well, too bad. Where's Chance? Chance, can you get some handouts out? You may be out of, oh, right. There's, thank you, Vanna. So that'll tell you everything you got to know about Wisdom House. So I won't take up any time on the details. I just want to make two quick announcements about it. Two programs that are coming up fairly soon. The first Wednesday in February is our Tennessee State Interfaith Harmony Week breakfast. I've been working in concert with the Jordanian delegation to the United Nations, and they pushed through at the UN Interfaith Harmony Week, which is the first week of February. And then I presented them with the idea that we create breakfasts around the planet. And we've got some in Australia and England and a couple in Africa, someplace in India. I don't have a list, but they're happening slowly. It's building up. There's a website that will be up and running shortly to try to get people to register for breakfast. But we will have a large breakfast here. Don't have the exact time. You'll have to check our website at Scarrett Bennett. But we're going to have a large interfaith breakfast with music and speakers and lots of food on the first Wednesday of February. The weekend prior to Valentine's Day, we're having our first, that's going to be our grand opening, our official opening of Wisdom House. That's going to be a weekend with Rumi, the Persian poet, Sufi poet. He's dead, so we're not actually bringing him back, but we are bringing in Kabir and Camille Helminski, who are major translators of Rumi. They're also the head of the Mevlevi Order of Sufism in North America, which is the Rumi's Order of Sufism. They're Turkish-trained, American-born, Turkish-trained, phenomenal teachers, and they'll be here for the weekend teaching us about Islam, about Sufism, about Rumi, and actually engaging us in some of the practices of Sufism so that we not only hear, but we also experience. You won't remember, but in May we have Dalai Lama is sending us 2 students to talk about Tibetan Buddhism. We've got a lot of stuff. The only thing I would like you to keep in mind, in addition to the February events, is we are looking for teachers. We have lunch programs where people will drop by twice a month and have lunch with us. We're looking for people who are interested in teaching informally introductory stuff, or if you're qualified, if you know someone who might be interested, pass that on and get them in touch with me here at Scarrett Bennett, and I'll talk to them about what we're looking for. We do an evening program once a month. We're looking for teachers for that. So we're just getting started. There's lots of ways you can help. You can read this and get a sense of what we need. But teachers and participants, that's key. This program tonight is collaboration between Vanderbilt and Scarrett Bennett and Wisdom House. And it's the brainchild of Chance Dillon, who is the Vandy intern at Wisdom House. And I'm going to let Chance introduce the theme and the participants.
Well, thank you, Rami.
You're welcome, Chance.
Well, good evening, and welcome to Recollecting Miriam, an intertextual encounter with Mary and Miriam in the biblical and Quranic traditions. As Rami said, my name is Chance Dillon. Before we move into the dialogical portion of our program, allow me to take a moment to recognize those who have made this event possible. I would like to thank Sharon Howell, the president of Scarrett Bennett Center, Kim Johnson, who can't be here tonight, obviously, Vice President of Educational Enrichment Programs and Community Relations, and Rabbi Rami, whom you've met, the Director of Wisdom House, for allowing me to bring this program to you tonight. In addition, I would like to thank Ellen Armour, the Director of the Carpenter Program at Vanderbilt University, the Reverend Gary White, Director of the Vanderbilt Office of Religious Life, Mark Bandis, the Dean of Students at Vanderbilt, the folks at Project Dialog, and my colleagues at Vanderbilt Divinity School, most notably my friends at Mosaic. I'm forever grateful for your encouragement, generous financial support, and of course the program assistance. So, let's meet our panel. Melanie Trexler is a graduate of Vanderbilt Divinity School and is currently a PhD candidate in theological and religious studies at Georgetown University. She works as a teaching and research assistant for the Prince Alwaleed bin Talal, did I say that right? Yeah, butchered it, so maybe like, okay, good. Center for Muslim Christian Understanding at Georgetown University. In the initial planning for this event, I knew I wanted to offer an intertextual study of Islam and Christianity, and Melanie, a close friend of my wife, Amy, and mine, suggested Mary and Miriam. That sealed it. Not only did I love the idea, but I knew just who I would ask to be on the panel. So, there you have it. Dr. Robin Jensen has a BA from Concordia College, an MA, an MPhil, and a PhD from Columbia University Union Theological Seminary. Yes, I know. Her research concentrates on Christian practices and non-textual expressions of the faith of the early church. Her most recent book, Face to Face, The Portrait of the Divine in Early Christianity, examines the development of the portrait of Jesus and the question of the visual image of God in Christian theology and devotional practice. Her current projects include a study of the architectural space and iconography of early Christian baptism and the practice of Christianity in Roman North Africa. She has traveled extensively in Italy, France, and the Middle East, as well as North Africa as part of her research and teaching. Prior to becoming Luce Chancellor's Professor of History of Christian Art and Worship at Vanderbilt Divinity School, Dr. Jensen was Professor of the History of Christianity and Director of the Program in Theology and Arts at Andover Newton Theological School. I first met Dr. Jensen in 2005 when she was delivering a presentation at Holy Trinity Greek Orthodox Church on the Theotokos, a Greek term used by the Orthodox Church to describe Mary as the God-bearer. I recall being quite impressed, obviously. As a Vanderbilt Divinity student, I have had the distinct honor and privilege of learning under Dr. Jensen on several occasions, and of course am most grateful for her teachings. Taiba Taylor is the founding editor-in-chief and publisher of Aziza Magazine, an award-winning publication. Through Aziza, Taiba has realized her vision of providing a vehicle for the voice of Muslim American women, a vehicle that portrays their perspectives and experiences and shatters commonly held stereotypes. She presently sits on the steering committee of WISE, Women's Islamic Initiative in Spirituality and Equality, an organization that convenes global Muslim women leaders and fosters Muslim women's participation in Islamic law and contemporary debates. Taiba has been named one of the 500 most influential Muslims in the world by the Middle Eastern think tank, the Royal Islamic Strategic Studies. She lived in Saudi Arabia for almost 7 years, where she studied Arabic and Islamic studies, and she has presented lectures on Islam and Muslim women at national and international conferences. Taiba has worked on several interfaith initiatives and traveled to Turkey, Spain, Morocco, Jerusalem, Greece, and Jordan with various groups of Jews, Christians, and Muslims. In the spring of 2010, she was one of 8 Muslims to meet His Holiness the Dalai Lama during an Islam-Buddhism Common Ground event. Raised by Christian parents, Taiba's path to Islam began during a 10th grade school field trip to a local mosque. She tells the story of her first encounter with Islam as a sort of homecoming. She continued to go back to the mosque for a number of weeks to learn more, assuring her father, who drove her there, that she was doing extra credit. And now our moderator. Ann Holmes Redding, minister, author, singer, educator, and spiritual director, has preached, taught, and presented nationally and internationally for over 25 years. In March 2006, Dr. Redding had an experience of convergence with Islam with her Christian life and practice. Her continuing participation in Islam makes me a better Christian, she says. This experience has resulted in her founding of the Abrahamic Reunion West, committed to healing the Abrahamic family's global dysfunction. Her dual religious affiliation also led in April 2009 to her defrocking after 25 years as an Episcopal priest, having served in parishes in New York, Atlanta, and Seattle. A graduate of Brown University and the General Theological Seminary, Dr. Redding received her PhD in New Testament from Union Theological Seminary in New York. She served on the faculty at the Interdenominational Theological Center in Atlanta for 9 years and has also taught at the School of Theology and Ministry at Seattle University, the General Theological Seminary, Mercer School of Theology, New York Theological Seminary, and the Institute for Black Catholic Studies at Xavier University, among other institutions. Co-author with Jamil Rahman and Kathleen Elias of Out of Darkness into Light, Spiritual Guidance in the Quran with Reflections from Jewish and Christian Sources. Her most recent publication is an article, The People of God and the Peoples of the Earth, in the People's Companion to the Bible, published by Fortress Press in March 2010. She's also a singer, specializing in jazz and classical music, and a creator of tangible wearable art, primarily jewelry and prayer beads. So we hope to provide some time towards the end of our program for your questions. And for this purpose, index cards are available, and individuals will be coming around to collect your questions as you complete them. So Heather, if you would please, if you would like an index card, if you feel there's a question already brewing in you, right, and you know you're going to be that one person that, well, one of many people who would like to have that opportunity, please take an index card and a pen, and once your question has been developed, at any point, if you would, if you'll raise your hand, someone will come and collect your index card. And then at the end, what we'll do is we'll draw from those various questions to determine what might be appropriate and what we might have time for. Also, before you leave, please sign in our guest registry and offer up feedback you might have about tonight's program there. And afterwards, we're going to have a reception right over here. It's a small area. I'm glad we didn't have too many folks, right? But I'm very pleased to see the number of folks and some familiar faces tonight. So at this time, it gives me great pleasure to present Recollecting Mariam.
Chance. I'm very, very happy to be here tonight, and want to start by expressing those thanks. And I'm grateful for the invitation, and consider it be quite an honor to be here with the women on the panel. Mariam has a very special place in my heart and life. I actually chose to be ordained on the 25th of March, which some people in this room might recognize as the day in my part of the Christian tradition when we celebrate the announcement of Jesus' birth to Mary, the Feast of the Annunciation, as it's called. And then 22 years later, I actually took my Shahada, became a Muslim, on March 25th. I didn't put it together until several days afterwards, but it just so happened that that day has had a special significance for me in both traditions that have claimed to me and that I claim. I have been drawing on this figure of Mary, drawing on her example as I have stepped out in faith in very important occasions in my life. So I was delighted to get this invitation to come and be able to participate on the panel and learn from these very wise, thoughtful, knowledgeable women. So let's get the conversation started. Our panelists have prepared some answers to some questions that were presented to get them started thinking about the topic. And I want to have them have the opportunity to be able to share what they've prepared, but also to talk to each other as ideas come up and to enlarge the conversation with those of you who have come out in the rain to participate tonight. So we will get started. We have, or we will have in a minute, since we are doing an intertextual look, to have some texts to show you. One from the Quran and one from the Bible. Well, actually two from the Quran and one from the Bible. This is not all of the material on Mary Mariam in either the Quran or the Bible, but we wanted to have some portion of the texts in front of us so that as we get this conversation started, we have some idea of what the scriptural language is about Mary Mariam in these two, in our Holy Scriptures. So, in the Quran. And when the angel said, O Mary, lo, Allah hath chosen thee and made thee pure, and hath preferred thee above all the women of creation. And then from another surah, another chapter in the Quran, the chapter that is on Mary, that is entitled Mariam, and make mention of Mary in the scripture, when she had withdrawn from her people to a chamber looking east, and had chosen seclusion from them. Then we sent unto her our spirit, and it assumed for her the likeness of a perfect man. She said, Lo, I seek refuge in the beneficent one from thee, if thou art God-fearing. He said, I am only a messenger of thy Lord, that I may bestow on thee a faultless son. She said, How can I have a son, when no mortal hath touched me, neither have I been unchaste? He said, So it will be. Thy Lord saith, It is easy for me, and it will be that we may make of him a revelation for mankind and a mercy from us, and it is a thing ordained. And she conceived him, and she withdrew with him to a far place. And the pangs of childbirth drove her unto the trunk of the palm tree. She said, Oh, would that I had died ere this, and had become a thing of naught, forgotten. Then one cried unto her from below her, saying, Grieve not. Thy Lord hath placed a rivulet beneath thee, and shake the trunk of the palm tree toward thee. Thou wilt cause ripe dates to fall upon thee. So eat and drink and be consoled. And if thou meetest any mortal, say, Lo, I have vowed a fast unto the beneficent, and may not speak this day to any mortal. Then she brought him to her, and both carrying him. They said, O Mary, thou hast come with an amazing thing. From the Bible, in the 6th month of Elizabeth's pregnancy, God sent the angel Gabriel to Nazareth, a town in Galilee, to a virgin pledged to be married to a man named Joseph, a descendant of David. The virgin's name was Mary. The angel went to her and said, Greetings, you who are highly favored. The Lord is with you. Mary was greatly troubled at his words and wondered what kind of greeting this might be. But the angel said to her, Do not be afraid, Mary. You have found favor with God. You will conceive and give birth to a son, and you are to call him Jesus. He will be great and will be called the Son of the Most High. The Lord God will give him the throne of his father David, and he will reign over Jacob's descendants forever. His kingdom will never end. How will this be? Mary asked the angel, since I am a virgin. The angel answered, The Holy Spirit will come you, and the power of the Most High will overshadow you. So the Holy One to be born will be called the Son of God. Even Elizabeth, your relative, is going to have a child in her old age, and she who is said to be unable to conceive is in her 6th month, for no word from God will ever fail. I am the Lord's servant, Mary answered. May your word to me be fulfilled. Then the angel left her. we have these readings as a jumping off point. But I want to ask first of our panelists what your first encounter with Mary was, what your recollections are of Mary. What are your early images? Where did they come from? Did you have a favorite Bible story, or what do you remember? What's your Mary connection?
My earliest memory of Mary comes from when I was 2 or 3 years old in a program called Mission Friends. We sang a song, and the lyrics went something like, Mary and Joseph took Jesus to church, took Jesus to church, took Jesus to church. Mary and Joseph took Jesus to church. Mary and Joseph loved Jesus.
Okay.
Song continues for me in like recollections of Mary, specifically around this time of year, around Christmas, singing in the choir, Away in the Manger, or later on as an adult, Ave Maria. Or a popular song now is Mary, Did You Know? Also, especially like within the Baptist church, from which I'm a part of, I remember watching Mary come down the center aisle of the church during Christmas pageants, following Joseph on their way to Bethlehem to register for the census. So, as a child, she appeared in song, and as an adult, she appears at Christmas. And that tends to be, when I recollect Mary, what I think of.
I had Protestant parents of two different stripes. My father was raised Baptist. My mother was raised Lutheran, but my mother was always a real free thinker. And so as children, we were sort of brought around to more and more sort of liberal Protestant mainline traditions, and we were finally in a congregational church, which satisfied my mother because, as she always told me, she kind of crossed her fingers when she got to the part of the creed about the Virgin Mary. She didn't believe in the virginity of Mary. But I was an odd child for her to have, because I was a very sort of a drama queen as a child, I think. And my best friend was Roman Catholic, and I would love to be at their house because it was filled with really exotic art and funny practices. But I was jealous of my friend because in her church they had nuns. And they had saints, and they had Mary. And I think that I was just taken with these female figures in particular. One quick story about that is, and I have to drag this out of my dimmest memories, but I think it was in first grade, and it was May, and it was, so it's the, my father always used to have this joke about being the queen of the May, and I didn't know what that meant. So I found myself at a school program with my friend. Somehow my mother, I think, was there as well, or that she found out about this later. And they wanted to find a little girl to carry up the flowers to Mary. And I don't know how it was, but I got chosen to do this. And my mother was absolutely mortified that this little Protestant girl got chosen to carry the flowers to Mary. So I was thrilled.
Well, I grew up in a Christian home that was non-denominational. It was a school of thought that really tried to sift out and marginalize man-made theology that they felt had crept into Christianity, and so Christmas was not celebrated. But we did hear the story of no room at the inn, so I think probably that was the first. And I grew up in a predominantly Roman Catholic community in Toronto, Canada. And one of the things that we would see quite frequently were parades around the neighborhood on certain days of saints, the festivals of saints. And so seeing images of Mary, those were certainly quite vivid in my mind, and it was a very festive event. When I began to delve into Islam and study Islam, I was very surprised and at the same time very delighted to find out there were stories of many of the biblical prophets as well as one of Mary, many stories about Mary. as many of you know, Islam and the Quran really came to renew and reinforce the spiritual messages of both Judaism and Christianity. And so there's a significant portion of the Quran that speaks of stories of biblical prophets, and because they were familiar to me, that's where I spent much of my time studying. And the story of Mary, when I realized that she was deemed one of the perfect women, and it was very, I think that of exhilarated, a bit of an exhilaration to have this connection of some part of my spiritual being continuing on to this new migration, the spiritual migration.
To continue in this line, when you think about your earliest connections to Mary and then your progress into the traditions that you have become part of or are now part of, does your tradition as a whole, where does Mary fit in your tradition as a whole? Are the stories about Mary, the traditions about Mary, central to your tradition, central to your understanding of your religion and practice? Go ahead, Taibu. Continue. I see you shaking your head.
Well, definitely the central entity of Islam is Allah. It's the creator, the sustainer, the most gracious, the most merciful. So to say that Mary has a special place in the theology wouldn't really be accurate. However, and I would even elaborate to say that as far as Mary's theological status, there is no consensus on that as well. There are some people who designate her as awliya, a friend of God. There's those people, or Siddaqun. And then there are those who say perhaps she's from the Anbiya, which is the prophets. So when you look at the theological status of Mary, she certainly isn't, there's no consensus at all. But there are many rich stories about her, and she is the only woman who's named by name in the Quran. She's the only woman who, and there are about 70 verses that refer to her, and she has her own chapter of the Quran. And so, and in that you learn not only of, before her birth you learn about her. You learn about her as a child, as a young woman, and as a woman. And I think one of the most positive and powerful stories for me was her re-entry into society after she had given birth to Jesus. And she walked with such, I'd say, serene dignity, centered in her faith of the divine, centered in her faith of God, and knowledge of herself, of who she was, even though she was going to be spoken badly about.
I think that within the Baptist faith, my early experiences of Mary were pretty spot on in terms of she comes out at Christmas. And then after that, we tend to put her back in the attic with the rest of the Christmas decorations. So she's usually gone by Epiphany. She may or may not come back out around Easter, and she may or may not come back out at Mother's Day, but that tends to be where Mary stays within, especially within the Baptist faith, and then within the larger Protestant tradition, there's some variations on that, but she doesn't tend to take the role, especially for Baptist.
Well, I'm speaking for the Catholic tradition. I am now Catholic, as you might have, some of you know, but and I probably could keep us here all night trying to answer how she's important to the Catholic tradition. So, and maybe because you're all laughing, you know that, how complicated it is. But one of the most important things I think that would distinguish, especially Christians of the Protestant and Baptist traditions, from Catholics is that the Bible is not the whole story for Catholics, right? We incorporate tradition, and so we have those great doctrines of Mary, her Immaculate Conception, her childhood, much like in the Quran, her girlhood, her marriage to Joseph, and then we get to the biblical parts of this, where she gives birth to the child, Jesus, and but then it goes on to her perpetual virginity, which is not in the Bible as such, although Catholics would say there's some hints of that. Protestants would say there are reasons not to think so. And finally ending with the story of her death and miraculous bodily assumption into heaven. So that's a sweeping addendum to the biblical tradition, I suppose one would say. And Catholics would take a couple of semesters of theological explanation to get you into understanding all of that, perhaps. I would love to just point out that this is the week in which we both celebrated the Immaculate Conception on December 8th, and tomorrow is the feast of the Virgin of Guadalupe. So this is a wonderful week for Mary. In the Catholic tradition. Got another week for that in the front.
Before we go on, I want to stay here for just a minute because I want to get at what some of the ways in which those beliefs about Mary, the stories that get told and added to the core of the scriptural tradition. I mean, what does that signify about her importance? What does it mean? Why were those stories, why do those traditions develop, do you think?
Well, one answer is that they're true. I have to say that. I think that a lot of people don't know, even a lot of Catholics don't know, that a lot of the traditions about Mary, her childhood, her own conception, her mother was not a virgin, but her mother conceived her without sexual intercourse. Her mother, or maybe even, and that is actually not even, that's just a miraculous conception somehow, and she is, in some miraculous sense, relieved of the stain of original sin, how to say that nicely, and her perpetual virginity. These stories are as early as 2nd century. Well, they weren't made up in the Middle Ages, and they weren't made up by some pope in Rome or something. They were actually quite ancient traditions, and the church, from almost as early as they began theologizing about even Christ, began to think about Mary, so that in much of the Marian, the word the Theotokos, which Chance brought up earlier, which means God-bearer in Greek, really emerges as part of a theological conversation about who is Christ, and how is Christ both human and divine. So these non-biblical traditions, these non-biblical doctrines, would arise out of theological discussions, as well as being really deeply embedded in the tradition of the church from very early times.
I think this is where a lot of Protestants misunderstand the Catholic doctrine, especially of Immaculate Conception and bodily
Ma'am, can you hold the microphone a little closer?
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Thank you.
I think this is where a big problem comes in between Protestants and Catholics. Specifically, like within my own tradition, I mean, I can say that it's often taken that Catholics worship Mary. And so a big concern is that if you elevate Mary, you're going to decrease the value of Jesus. So you bring Jesus down as you're attempting to elevate Mary. And so I think that becomes a point of conflict and tension within the larger Christian tradition due to a big misunderstanding.
And then, Ayiva, talk about this in Islam, please.
And of course, in Islam, because we don't believe that God has any sons or daughters, that there's nothing like unto God without any partners. Mary is not considered the mother of God or the mother of the Son of God. And actually, Jesus is referred to in the Quran as the son of Mary. But beyond that, Mary is not simply seen as the mother of Prophet Jesus, may peace be upon them both. Mary is seen as a spiritual luminary on her own, one of the most perfect women, a woman who, her devotion, her sincerity, her nearness to God, her approach to God is on a very high level. And I know you're going to ask another question. I think we differentiate, she's differentiated in that many of the Muslim women in the tradition who attained high levels of spirituality did so either by effacing themselves physically to kind of diminish their feminine functions of menstruation and childbirth capacities, and in almost trying to become like men. But Mary, we believe, did it without that process. And, you know, being an example of the believing woman who is a mother and yet attains this high, high level of spirituality. And so therefore, you know, being that example of al-Qanitin.
Could you translate that first?
This, in sorts of Tahrim, is this done? It's going in
Well, it's coming and going.
In one of the surahs of the Quran, Surah Al-Tahrim, there's an ayat, the end of the ayat that says, وَكَانَتْ مِنَ الْقَانِتِينَ. And this is very important in that the Arabic is a gender-specific language, and the female is always included in the male unless otherwise specified. And so when it says كَانَتْ مِنَ الْقَانِتِينَ, she was of those who were very obedient and devoted to God. And qanitin, if she had said وَكَانَتْ مِنَ الْقَانِتَاتِ, that would mean she would have of the female believers and worshipers. But min al-qanitin means of all humanity, of those who were very devoutly obedient to God. And this word qanut means obedience. It's often translated as obedience, but you can't be obedient, you can't refer to obedience to a human being. It's only obedience to the supreme being of God. And so in this ayat, it really designates her as being an example for all human beings who are striving to attain the highest level of God consciousness that they can.
In your traditions, are there devotions or practices that focus on Mary? And if so, how do they focus on Mary, and what is her role in those practices? Yeah, Robin. You're the one who...
Oh, where do I start? Where do I stop? I just want to say how much I appreciate what you just said, Tayyiba, because one of the things that I think is also true in the Catholic tradition is to see Mary as a model for women apart from her childbearing functions, really. I mean, she's there, but she also becomes this figure of a model for a disciple, and first disciple would be one way to think of her. So, yes, all kinds, I mean, the May Queen, right? And the Rosary, as you all probably know, the practice of prayer, which honors Mary. In the East, and I will kind of try to pick up for the Orthodox, since I had handling that end of the Catholic and Orthodox tradition, perhaps, the idea, the icon of Mary as an image for prayer. And so, yes, I mean, we have enormous numbers, and probably all of you are familiar with them. We might have some questions about those later. Mary. Most Catholic churches have a chapel dedicated to Mary, with a statue of Mary. So, the Lady Chapel.
of the problem, I think part of the problem from within my own tradition is that there is such a fear that you would worship anything but God or but God's Son, that I don't think we built up anything with Mary. And I think that's, we'll get to this, I think, probably later, but I think that's probably a deficit within the tradition. And there's, I think, a wealth there that can be mined, especially for Baptists who want to even use the text. I think there's a lot there that can be used, that can be helpful. It just hasn't really taken off yet.
And like Melanie just said, in Islam, I think that the greatest diversion or error you can commit is worshiping anything other than God. And so for that reason, there's nothing surrounding Mary as far as worship is concerned. Where you would find her in ritual, however, is that when Muslims stand to pray 5 times a day, you recite something from the Quran. And this is completely up to the person who's leading the prayer. We don't have special surahs to recite on special days. Whatever you're moved to recite, you recite. And so it's possible that Surah Al-Maryam would be recited in the prayers, everyday prayers, the 5 ritual prayers.
In Sufism, are there any practices around Mary in Sufism that you know of?
Not really, just to evoke her in terms of universal compassion. But again, not, because Islam is an iconic religion without images, and so keeping as far away from that as possible, and that's very important. That's central, the essence of Islam.
If you've been paying attention to any of the news stories coming out of Egypt, we've had a Marian apparition that's appeared at a Coptic church. And it's not just Coptic Christians who are going to see whatever they can see. It's also Muslims who will go to watch. And then it becomes a question of, well, what's being experienced? And people from both sides of both traditions are reporting a miraculous vision. They're reporting healings. So, I mean, in popular practice, it might be there. But the question is, what's going on the ground is something I don't know that anybody can necessarily answer.
I'm really glad you brought that up. I was thinking, I should have said something about the apparitions and the shrines and the feast days. You've all heard of Lourdes, but Fatima, Guadalupe, Conyers, Georgia, Madrigoria, Lubbock, Texas. We have, I don't even want to dignify it, but I suppose the Mary Bun that was over there at Bongo Java, part of our tradition. And this takes us from the Catholic side into the great area of popular practices, and that's just as complicated as an encyclopedia could be.
There is no theological background for this. However, oftentimes when Muslim women are expecting, they recite or read Surah Al-Maryam with their morning devotions. And that's, of course, because it has a story of her giving birth and how she professed this innate strength and courage as she was giving birth. And in the Quran, she gives birth alone in the desert under a palm tree. She's not in a manger, and she doesn't have any support. So reading that surah over and over helps. Some women do it, many women do it while they're pregnant.
So this brings me to the whole area of Mary as a model specifically for women, and how that works in our traditions, and what impact does Mary or Mariam have on the way women are viewed in your tradition, if any, and should she be a model for women's empowerment?
I came to Mary from the Protestant tradition, and I should say that I wrote a master's thesis on Mary. And so in a little bit of time before I started my PhD program, I was sort of on a little funny lecture circuit where Catholic churches would invite me to come and talk. and I wasn't Catholic, and I thought this was very odd. And I ran into, at that time, and it would have been the 1980s, a lot of disaffected Catholic women who were really upset about Mary as a model because she was being given to them as children as somebody who was obedient and passive and sweet and on a pedestal and virginal, and they wanted, in the early days of feminism, no part of that. And I came into it saying, I love this person, and then, it's like, but I would say that my discovery of her was because I didn't have that upbringing. I didn't have to overcome that, right? So I found in her the great model of prophecy, the woman who sings the Magnificat, she's with the disciples at Pentecost. She's at the foot of the cross. And so there was so much in this for me that I hadn't encountered as a young, growing up in my parents' Protestant tradition, which didn't have any figures for women in those days. It was well before we had a lot of women in the ministry. And so, even the ushers were men. Everybody, the only important figure you could be in a Protestant church as I was growing up was the minister's wife. So, and I thought how interesting that she became a model of liberation for me, because I hadn't grown up with her as a model of oppression at all. But I recognized that it was two sides of the story, at least.
I think the lack of attention to Mary and to women in general can lead to forms of patriarchy and hierarchy within the church that can at times exclude women. That said, just because you have Mary and models of women doesn't guarantee that women are going to be included in those models either. So you're not going to change the system just by suddenly paying attention to Mary. That said, I do think she can be particularly helpful for women, for people and for Protestants who want to go back to the text. We do see that she is a prophetess. That's what she does in Luke when she's speaking the Magnificat. She's talking about this model of God that she understands, that's at work in the world, that's going to come in through the person of the Messiah. You see her as a disciple, like Robin said. She is at the foot of the cross. She's the one that constantly testifies to Jesus' humanity, and she constantly tells us of what it means when you're a believer that you follow Christ. It doesn't mean you necessarily know what you're doing. It just means you show up sometimes.
Well, I think there is a danger of her becoming a symbol or an example of something that's unattainable or something that is not achievable. And on the other end, there is the danger of her becoming simply a figure of, the mother of the prophet. And beyond, in between all that dynamic tension, she can be a model of women's, and I would say empowerment, definitely a role model for women's empowerment in that she allows women to, again, like I say, take full spiritual agency no matter what stage of life you're at, and attain high levels of God consciousness and spirituality in doing so. I think that, no, we'll stop there.
Oh, okay.
Do you want to say something to that? Oh.
How do you see, given the fact that the Islamic tradition has a wealth of pretty powerful female figures, specifically I'm thinking Fatima, especially for the she, or Khadija, Muhammad's first wife, how do you see Mary in relation to those two women? Does she get priority because she's textually based? How does that fit in?
There are actually 4 women who are quoted as being the perfect women. And Asiya, the wife of Pharaoh, who challenged Moses, Mary, the mother of Jesus, or daughter of Imran, Khadijah, and Fatima, Khadijah, the wife of the prophet, and Fatima, the daughter of the prophet. So those are considered for perfect women. Mary, as I said before, she's the only woman who's mentioned by name in the Quran, and the only woman that we have this long, rich history of. Over 70 verses in the Quran actually reference her, and she has her own chapter. And she's also she's in the text, she is referred to as a sign for human beings. Her and Prophet Jesus, peace be upon them both, are mentioned as a sign for humanity. And so in that, I think even when we talk about Eve or the other three women who are considered in that category of perfect women, I think Mary stands out in that she's the only one that has that designation. There's an ayat, the verse in the Quran that says, "We have chosen you over other women." Did we read that one?
Yes.
And of course, then the one that says that you're a sign, and the last one is Surah Tahrim that says, "Wasadaqat kalimat wa kutubihi," and she bear witness to and the revelations and the books of God, and in doing so, witnessing God's truth and God's revelation. And so that is sometimes used to propel her to the status of Anbiya or a prophet. Some people, of course, like I said before, there's no consensus on that, so some people say definitely not. But I would say, well, some people also want to argue that Asiya was a prophet, but I would say definitely Mary has a lot of weight.
Spiritual weight.
One of the and this is something that occurs to me as I listen to you and think about what we get taught about Mary and the whole notion of perfection in humanity. And I hear it in the Catholic tradition and in the Islamic traditions particularly, that one of the ways that Mary gets singled out is a level of perfection in humanity. The Immaculate Conception, that whole notion of Immaculate Conception. And so she gets separated and kind of nudged to this side of this dividing line in Christianity, the dividing line between the divine and human, which Jesus, strides. Sometimes Mary gets pushed to that side, and the practices, some of the popular practices around Mary point to her sharing in most closely in Jesus' singularity in relationship to God, more closely than any other human. And do you see any, obviously in the Protestant tradition, that's seen as a problem, but what occurs to me as I listen is that from the Islamic point of view, perfection in human beings is not an impossibility. There are perfect human beings. In Christianity, there's some dispute about that. And Mary has a very unique role in this whole discussion, I believe. Does any of you want to comment about that? The whole notion of perfection, purity, and how that plays out in terms of Mary and Mary's relationship to the rest of the faithful.
I think that's the danger point, is for my Catholic women friends who grew up in parochial schools, maybe with nuns, the idea of perfection and purity, the unattainability of this person. I don't think that's biblical. I don't know that it's even necessarily traditional. I think it's popular. But the Immaculate Conception didn't mean that she didn't ever make a mistake or ever she was a little pushy, if few times with Jesus. If you think about the wedding at Cana story, she even sort of thought that he was going a little nuts in one of the Gospels of Matthew or Mark. Anyway, so there is a real person there, and she's no plaster goddess. I mean, she's actually. So I think but I think that is the popular reception of this purity, perfection thing, which can snag us, but I think that's something. First of all, I want to say the virginal conception is certainly biblical. I'm not going to try to debate that, I hope, right now. At least I wouldn't want to. But, and one could say, well, why does Jesus need to be conceived of a virgin? Why is that in the text? And in some way, it is in part because she is a person apart. It is a different conception than anybody else's. It is a different thing that's happening. It's an inbreaking of something new. And in that, because she is chosen and she accepts the role of being the one who will give birth to this child, she is different from the rest of the women that ever come along. And in some ways, she gets to, we sort of laughingly talk about Mary as the intercessor in prayer. She's like, if you're going to get to Dad, you got to go to Mom. And she's going to have more pull. But she's never made to be God. She's just got a close relationship because she's the mother. She's the mommy.
Well, in Islam, there's a term that is used with Mary, batul, which transcends physical purity, and it gets into the area of spiritual purity. And for me, it's, and there's also the prayer of her mother when Mary's mother was expecting with her, and she asked that Mary be protected from the devil and Satan. And in Islam, when they talk about the prophets, there's something called isma, which means that there's this innate protection from gross error. And so that's another criteria that they use to determine who is a rasul, a messenger, and who is a nabi, a prophet. And that's also one of the things that goes with Mary. But beyond that, I would say that she's also an example of the Arabic term is tawakkul, reliance on God. And I think this is probably one of the attributes that she presents that I think is certainly attainable and certainly can resonate with many of us. When she was told that she was going to bear this child, she knew it would be a difficulty. She knew she would be marked and judged, but yet she realized on God. There's a verse in the Quran that says that وَمَن يَتَوَكَّلَ اللَّهُ فَهُوَ حَسْبُهُ, and the one who relies on God, for God is enough. And we see constantly, in the stories of Mary, not only she relies on God for spiritual guidance and food, but also physical food. There's a story in the Quran that when Zechariah came to see her, to feed her, there was already food there. And he said, where did you get this food? And she said, Allah is the one that gives sustenance to all. And so this understanding of reliance on God, this is, to me, is not just her purity, physical purity or her spiritual purity, but the way that she was willing and with devotion aligned herself to God's will and relied on God for her sustenance. That to me is really the essence of Mary.
I think a large concern for seeing Mary as being someone who is perfect is the idea that it gets into conversations of God's grace. And we want to, especially for my tradition, we want to make sure that it is God who gives blessings and it is God who chooses. We don't want it to be Mary's perfection that earns her into this status, which is, again, I don't think that's what's being said, but I think that's often what we hear, which is a problem sometimes.
So is it important I've heard in several of the traditions, is it important, more important that Mary be some kind of special figure for women? Or is it more important that she be some kind of symbol for all of humanity? And if we're looking at this in some kind of feminist perspective, which was part of the charge for this particular look at Mary, what do you have to say about the relative importance of Mary as a figure for all of humanity, or specifically for women? And what does that look?
I think, in my understanding of feminism, it's wanting the well-being and the flourishing of all things and all people. And so it's important that she not just be for women, but that she be accessible for men. And I think a way that you're seeing, especially now, ironically enough, the Southern Baptists have put forth a model called servant leadership, with which you may or may not be familiar. But the idea behind it being, in order to lead, we must be servants. And Mary can be a great model for that, because in Luke, she says, I am your servant, Lord, let it be as your word says that it will. And so I think if you can, that can be interpreted very negatively as no one wants to be a servant. But then again, if you go back to Mark, Jesus says, I come and I am the servant of the world. So in that way, you can see Mary being an imitator of Christ. And so in that way, Mary can be empowering for all people and for all of humanity. And I think that becomes a helpful tool especially for Baptists in trying to empower women in addition to men.
I think in Islam she's both. She's both because there's that verse that says, we've chosen you over all women of the world, and then that you are an example for all humanity. So I think it's both. I think, we can take a step back and say that for centuries, the sole interpreters of the primary sources of Islam have been men, and they have interpreted verses about women through a very androcentric lens and from their frame of reference. And in doing so, they have done that about Mary as well. And the issue of whether she can be considered a prophet or not, I think is an important one that needs to be developed somewhat, because if not, then it leaves people with the idea that, that attaining that high level of God consciousness and spiritual, just that level of closeness to God is a function of your gender birthright. And so I think that there's social and spiritual ramifications for developing a more, writing the gender asymmetry that has been created by having men as the primary, as the only interpreters of the primary sources of life. And let me say that as more and more women choose as their field of scholarship Islamic theology, it's really helping to correct that. So it's going, actually this book that I have here, Mary the Blessed Virgin of Islam, is written by a female scholar who's since, passed on. But it's one that's very important, and it's good reading.
There's so much parallel for us. I mean, obviously, that we have also lived in worlds of male interpretation of these texts. Male devotion to Mary has always been probably greater than female devotion to Mary. Mary was not a figure for women. John Paul II would be the best example I can think of as somebody who was deeply devoted to Mary and wrote the encyclical on Mary in 1987, or thereabouts. So what I think the tricky part is trying to open this up so that it isn't the male version of Mary or the Pope's version of Mary, or necessarily even just the Catholic version of Mary, because Protestant women, Protestant theologians, as well as Catholic women theologians, are now really working on this. I mean, I can think of Beverly Gaventa on one side, who's a Presbyterian woman who is writing in Princeton on the faculty at Princeton Theological Seminary. Is very interested in this. Elizabeth Johnson from the Catholic side at Fordham University, really discovering new avenues for Mary, and not just for women, although they're both coming at it with a feminist lens, different kinds of feminist lenses. So sometimes I'd like to think about the fact that I said this earlier when we were discussing that, something like the Song of Songs, in which you have the figure of the bride. And the bride can be Mary, sometimes it might be. The bride might be thought of as the soul, the human soul, which is conceived sometimes in a feminine aspect, and men as well as women can be brides in that respect. And sometimes it's the church. And the church is also the bride of Christ. And so, and that doesn't just mean women. So when we think about how we get past these really divided gender distinctions, I think we'll really be getting someplace hopeful and positive.
We're getting close to the time when we want to open up the conversation to the audience, and I want to give each one of you a chance to say anything that you will regret not saying when you leave here. So give you an opportunity to say whatever you'd like to say for a closing, at this moment, of closing.
And as they're saying those things, if you have an index card with a question on it, I'll come around and collect those. So.
And I'll just reiterate what I said before, that Mary in the Quran is a spiritual luminary in her own right, not seen as simply the mother of a prophet, but really as an example of someone who attained one of the highest levels of God consciousness and devotion and obedience to God.
I think that for Protestants who want to say that the Bible is our major authority, part of what that means then is going back to the text and finding out what does it say about Mary. And I think that there's a lot there that can be useful. And as Robin mentioned, there have been recent efforts of Protestants who want to reclaim and recollect Mary. And if you're interested, a volume that's out that's pretty good is The Blessed One, and it's edited by Beverly Gaventa.
I just wanted to, because I forgot to mention this one, in terms of biblical stories, one place the Catholic tradition really, and draws so much for their artwork from, is Revelation 12. A great portent appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. She was pregnant and crying out in birth pangs in the agony of giving birth. And of course you know the story. Maybe you know. I hope you know the story. It's a great image, and it's a great vision. The source of tremendous Western and art, especially.
Well, I'd like to thank you so far, and I'm going to look over these questions. I'm going to take just a little breather. You can speak among yourselves while I organize these questions and get, but first let's thank the panelists.
I actually have a little story to share. This is a little impromptu, right? As we take a break. Something happened the other day that I have to share. I think you know where I'm at.
Yes.
Okay. So we had the privilege, my 3-year-old daughter Adelaide and I had the privilege of taking Tiba to prayer at 1 o'clock prayer at the Islamic Center in Nashville the other day. And on our way back, we played a little game of I Spy, right, as it's fun to do on trips with children. And the first thing that my little girl spied was something red. And I looked over, and Taiba had on a red hijab, a red headscarf. So I knew right away my daughter has tracked onto this thing that she doesn't see very often. Now, I'm from the Christian tradition, so she doesn't see this really ever. And it was very compelling for her. So she said, well, now, Addie, is it something that's in the car? She said, yes. Okay, is it something that Taiba is wearing? And she said, yes. I said, well, would you like to ask Taiba what that is? And she said, okay. Taiba, what is that? So she told her that it's a hijab, and she repeated the word hijab. And she said, it's a headscarf. And I said, Addie, do you like that? She said, oh, yes. I said, Addie, would you like to wear a headscarf? And she said, yes, I want one for Christmas. And we laughed, and I said, of course, only in America would you get a hijab for Christmas. So I had to share that little story of interaction.
Okay, there are a number of, I'm going to apologize in advance because I know we're probably not going to get to all of these questions because each one of them is worthy of a good bit of discussion. But I'm going to start with one that asks the question, it's a comment, but I'd like to hear people's comment, the panelists' comments on this, that quoting from the Magnificat, the hymn of Mary, that when she talks about God having brought down the powerful from their thrones and lifted up the lowly, filled the hungry with good things and sent the rich away empty. And there's an emphasis in that passage on Mary as prophet, in Christian terms, in Christian use of the word prophet. And the comment here is that all three traditions, Christian, Jewish, and Muslim, but here we're focusing obviously on Christian and Muslim, have an emphasis on social justice and the poor. And so is there any relationship in the traditions between Mary's role and the emphasis on social justice and righting the wrongs of society that either that goes beyond the Magnificat, goes beyond that hymn?
I think in terms of social justice, the only thing you could really extrapolate from the stories in the Quran would be when she did re-enter society as an unwed mother, and her standing firm, knowing that she would be judged. And so perhaps the whole thing around judging people and reacting to people's situations might be, I think, probably the only thing you could talk about in terms of social justice. The rush to judgment and to categorize people.
I think where I've seen it used the most within my tradition has come in through mission trips. It becomes a really good verse to put on the back of the t-shirt when you're going to go build Habitat for Humanity or you're going to go work at a soup kitchen. That's where I see it used a lot, but I think that it's definitely there, and it can and should be used more than what I can. I think it can and should be used more probably than what it is.
I think where I would see it most powerfully is in Mary in the tradition, where she is the Virgin of Guadalupe, and she becomes the soul of the people, and she is for them the spiritual guide, the mother, the leader, and in those instances, I think, for certain communities, especially in the third world, sometimes Mary is a very important resource for strength. And that doesn't come out of necessarily just out of the Magnificat. It comes out of the relationship too.
Any other comments on that? What is the relationship between Mary and Jesus in the traditions that you represent? What kind of interactions do they have in their holy books, and what do those interactions say about the nature of their role in the respective faiths? The relationship between Jesus and Mary.
One of the stories in in the Quran, when Mary re-entered society after giving birth to Jesus, she took a vow of fasting both from food and from speech. So she had taken a vow of silence. So when she came into the town and they said, "What have you done? You were the sister of Aaron, and your parents were upstanding citizens and not unchaste. What is this that you've done?" And because she had taken that vow of silence, she pointed to Jesus. And in the Quran, Jesus actually speaks. And so it was Jesus coming to her defense, even though he was a child at that time, and the very close connection. And again, when Jesus is referred to in the Quran, he's referred to as the son of Mary. And so there's that connection there.
I know we've referenced Gavinta a couple of times already, but she provides, in an essay in The Blessed One, she provides a way that we can look at this by looking at Mary in Matthew, Luke, and then in John. And in Matthew, what you see with the relationality between Mary and Jesus is you see that they are both threatened and they are threatening. So they are threatened in terms of Joseph has the choice to potentially divorce Mary. He doesn't because Gabriel intervenes. They are threatening to the social system, to the powers that be. And so that relationality, it's kind of like wherever Jesus goes, Mary's going to be with her. In Luke, you see their relationship in terms of Mary being a disciple of Jesus, Mary being the prophet that speaks about what Jesus is coming to do for the world. But you also see her as being a mother who ponders these things in her heart. So you see her as being that perhaps nurturing, loving, caring woman for her son. And then in John, she's at the wedding at Cana. She's telling him, look, we've got to get this wedding on track here. So you see her kind of that mothering figure, but she's also a testament to his humanity. She appears in John 2, right after John 1, that's told us, in the beginning there was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and the Word dwelled among us in the flesh. And in John 2, there she is saying, look, this is the Word, and that is the flesh, and he is my son. And in fact, in John, she's only the mother of Jesus. She is not named as Mary. She appears again for the second time, and the only time in John, at the foot of the cross, where Jesus looks at her and says, woman, take this beloved disciple as your son. And so you see a very traditional interpretation of that, especially for Baptists, is that is Jesus still caring for his mother in the way that he can as he is dying, saying, I can't provide for you anymore, but I'm going to make sure you're taken care of. And so she's interpreted within this relationship of love that he has for her and that she has for him, because she keeps being there wherever he is.
I would add just one more point to yours, Melanie. In Luke, of course, she loses him in the temple, and that's a great story. Like she gets really mad at him, and it's like, did she forget all the things with the shepherds and the wise men and what? And it sort of refers back to, and she treasures all these things in her heart again. So you have this really wonderful, very human mother who is, and I think it's at the foot of the cross. It's not just for me the idea that he's caring for her, which he is. But I really think and I wanted to say this earlier, but it's not a social justice question quite, but it comes close, is the mothers that watch their children die. And this is hard for me. And that reality of Mary as having to go through that suffering and understanding that, as you then cast your thought back to the danger that they had to flee from in the Lucan story as they went into Egypt. Matthew, yes, thank you. When they went into Egypt because they were in danger, and in many ways that I think people could relate to, refugees fleeing from danger.
Thank you. How is the difference between Christian and Muslim conceptions of the nature and role of Jesus, that is to say, as for in Christianity, Redeemer, intercessor, Son of God, as opposed to prophet, Islam, how is the difference in those conceptions about Jesus reflected in their respective conceptions about Mary, the nature and role of Mary?
I think I heard that question right.
Okay.
We're asking about
Say
the
it again.
theological understandings of Jesus.
Right, theological understanding of Jesus, how are those differences reflected in the differences in the understanding of Mary?
Well, I really would bore you to tears if I tried to walk you through the whole Christological controversy, and some of you may have heard about that, but there's some laughter out there. Somebody just got the formation club. Right? Of course, part of the question is, to whom did Mary give birth? Did she give birth to God? Did she give birth to Christ? Did she give birth to somebody who was already in her womb, both God and Christ? And this becomes the big debating point in the 5th century, and how she gains her title in the Orthodox tradition, the God-bearer, which troubles other traditions a great deal. There's those who would say that that's not the word we want to use. But it is as much a statement about who Christ is, in a sense, as who Mary is. I think that's probably enough on that. I'll see if Melanie wants to weigh in.
I mean, I think that the important thing becomes is that she is the mother of Jesus. I mean, Baptists aren't going to say the mother of God because logically we can't conceive of how Mary would birth God. But I think it's also important just to see Mary as an ordinary, regular human being, and that she does indeed give birth to this person who is fully human, fully divine, and that he is the Christ, and that is the person who all people should be following.
And again, in Islam, the concept of God without any partners, without any children, is so central and to Islam that really to go off into those tangents is really not theologically, I wouldn't say productive. So Mary being the mother of Jesus, Jesus being a prophet, and as I said, many scholars also considering that Mary herself was also a prophet. So,
Thank you. I think that we probably pretty much dealt with the difference between the dogma of the virginal conception of Jesus and the dogma of the Immaculate Conception of Mary, but we do still have a question about that, so do you want to?
I better do it. How many of you want to take this?
In the Quran, there's no
I know.
immaculate conception of
Yeah.
Mary.
And you probably don't want to. Well, you can come and tell me this.
I mean,
She'll have a different point of view, so that will be good. I think actually many people misunderstand the term Immaculate Conception. So first of all, it refers to Mary's mother's conception of her, not Mary's conception of Jesus. So, and even there are a lot of Catholics that don't even understand that, so don't feel bad out there if you didn't know that difference. And so, in fact, would have been Wednesday or so, I think it was Wednesday, we had a lot of questions about why is it the Immaculate Conception can come just 2 weeks before Christmas? You know, and so, oh, no, it's Mary's conception, and her birthday is 9 months later on September 8th. So there's that, and I'm not sure what's the relationship of the two?
Yeah, what's the difference? Yeah,
Well,
I think you just
one could
answered.
say there's a relationship between the two, because one could actually sort of imagine pushing back from the idea that Jesus is fully God, and in order to be born of a woman, she would need to be without stain of original sin, and so that's sort of where could be the genesis of this doctrine, if it's not true, which was the option. But I think that could be the relationship of the two, to think about it that way. That there was some idea that the flesh that Jesus would take from the woman, human body, would be that which would not have been stained by original sin.
I just say, you know.
in the Quran, there is no Immaculate Conception of Mary. There is certainly the story about her mother being barren and praying to God to conceive, and dedicating what is in her womb. When she conceived, she said that she would dedicate what's in her womb to be consecrated at the temple. And when it was a female child, and of course at that time only males were consecrated, she still sent her to the temple to be taught by the rabbis. And so it's a little bit different, quite different actually.
I think I should add just here that there isn't any way that anybody's figured out how it happened. It's just asserted that Mary was without sin. There's not, I mean, it doesn't, her mother, there also is a story of Anna being barren and Zechariah, and it's a miraculous birth in that sense. But the Immaculate Conception doesn't necessarily even really deal with how Anna and Joachim happened to have the child.
And for Muslims, one of the tenets of faith is belief in the unseen. And as we know, things that we thought impossible 100 years ago or even last year, now it's quite, our lives are changing so quickly. And so understanding that the realm of possibility is so much greater than we understand. And so for Muslims, we do actually take it literally that this was a virgin birth. And that, it was so. And she never got married. In the Muslim tradition, Mary stays unmarried.
We have come to the end of our time, and so there are a couple of more questions, and I hope that people are staying for the reception so that you can approach the panelists if they're ready and willing to be approached and ask them some of the questions that we did not get to. But I would like to thank them again for this.